Thanks very much. And I do a lot of work talking with communities of farmers, and normally I'm sort of the token greenie talking to farmers who loathe me for what I'm bringing up, and now I'm going to be the token redneck talking to you lot. So, which is a really dumb idea, and it'd be, I was thinking this morning, why did I decide to do this? But anyhow, what I want to basically do is just talk through my experience of a project where we were working with a CSIRO project on evaluating transformative adaptation options for Australian farming. And so it was funded as part of the Fill in the Research Gap, and this basic diagram that Mark Howden drew that has this very much discussed idea of these sort of incremental change, or in the first place leading up to transformational change, and this notion that because climate change is facing us, we need to look for transformational change. And inherent in the discussion is that transformational change is good and necessary, and incremental change is changing the chairs on the Titanic, and it's playing with the edges rather than that. I guess the simple message that I've had to confront is that the farmers that I speak to, many are saying climate change isn't real, but of the ones who are saying climate change is real and something they're really going to deal with, they're still very reluctant to talk about transformational change. They're very much, so that's the challenge I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a discussion about whether human-induced climate change, that's a very uninteresting discussion. This is a discussion about people who accept that climate change is happening and real. How do we manage it? The notion of these transformative changes, these are land use practices that are adopted at a much larger scale or intensity, those that are truly new to a particular region or resource system, or that transform places and shift locations. So there's real interest on where people really are doing something different in an anticipatory sense. A consistent view that I'm wanting to report is that wheat-sheep system was seen as hard to beat, and there was extreme confidence in the wheat-sheep system in the near future and the adaptation for that. Interestingly, this was not just totally from ignorance. In the 80s, there was a real crash of wheat prices, and there was a real discussion about alternatives. There's a whole exercise on redesigning Australian agricultural landscapes, RALs. There's been a big effort in the past about how do we take European farming systems and make them, understand properly Australian systems. People saying things like, if Aboriginal people went to England, they wouldn't chop down all the trees, plant eucalypts and run kangaroos. They're trying to fund that system, so why did we do that when we came here? However, the southern Mediterranean system suits wheat-sheep farming. For someone like me, it's an annoyingly well. So if I'm trying to talk to farmers about how we need to change these things, wheat-sheep farming suits this system extremely well and is incredibly robust in many ways. Part of that confidence in the near future is that they had seen examples like, so Kadina Tafe apparently ran these exercises where they were going to grow Australian native for flora and for the flowers and the leaves and so on. And actually, and this guy had said, I'd taken delivery of this stuff. I'd done some of this. These were they looked at the olives. They looked at the ostriches and all the bizarre ideas and so on. And they were sceptical because what they'd seen is that wheat-sheep farming had continued to do reasonably well. That's not to say there's not problems with it, but even the increasing debt that they're carrying in many ways is still, in one sense, a vote in the future. They are borrowing money to keep investing into the future. So that's the situation. Now, why is that? Firstly, and this is that the models that we were using, these are the models that we had to use sort of nationally through this CSIRO project. For 2030, most of the models do not show in big changes in rainfall. In that case, the GFDL is a really drying one. So it's not so that, and also because we're looking at a fairly short time ahead, and that was a requirement from DAF for us to do that, we're not seeing enormous changes in that time. Another factor is that, there's a picture of Minnepa, and that's a group of, there's EPARC, which are some people from Adelaide Uni, but also farmers and agronomists in that area. And this question in early 2000s about a run of terrible years. And when it's dry at Minnepa, it's really dry, okay? So it's you're getting very, very low rainfall. So this question there was, is this drought or aridity? Drought or drying? Are we seeing a cycle? Are we seeing a step change? There was a lot of discussion about step change in that time. And then Minnepa had, after that point, they had about 2 other really bad years, decile 1 sort of years. Since 2009, Minnepa has just had cracker years. Every year. It's just had really good years. It's a sobering point that at the time, people were saying, this is climate change, decile 3 and below, get used to it, that's what you're going to be facing. Trying to farm in those areas was a folly in the first place. Climate change is just showing you that's the case. Minnepa has just had a run of really good years in that time. Now that's just variability, and yes, there are heat waves and so on, but in terms of rainfall, that has changed. I would say that the over-attribution of the millennium drought to climate change in simplistic ways, in the media at least, has been a problem. Okay, so when we say that the millennium drought, that's climate change, yes, there may be a climate change fingerprint in that, but obviously what happens when we say that is when it rains, credibility becomes hard. So there's a lot of decadal and year-to-year variability in this. Also, farmers have good reasons to be optimists because there have been a series of adaptation. So they're talking about a dynamic system where things have improved, and obviously things like zero tillage and so on have improved in recent time as well. So they're technological optimists. I guess what I'm saying is that the nature of uncertainty and urgency for greenhouse gas reduction and adaptation are different. So the extreme urgency to reduce greenhouse gases, we've really passed that time. We really do need to do things to reduce greenhouse gases. Adaptation is important and path dependent, but do we sometimes overstate the urgency? So it's a really important book, Merchants of Doubt, which makes the argument that basically, in terms of the need to reduce greenhouse gases, there's been a very clever way of using uncertainty by vested interest in a mischievous way to do that. But as soon as you say uncertainty in terms of adaptation, people look at you a bit suspiciously as if you're sort of somehow dismissing climate change. I fully agree with the critical decade. So this notion that we are really in this time in terms of the need to reduce emissions, that's really critical. My basic point is that that critical decade doesn't necessarily translate into the same level of urgency for all adaptation for everybody. So this diagram, which I think is a really important diagram from that critical decade, that basically we've only got so much carbon dioxide we can emit, and we're using it up much faster than we can. So we're on a trajectory which is quite concerning. The question of can we draw that diagram for adaptation, I believe we can in some situations, but that's usually where something else is dominating the factor. Again, it's again from this same diagram. I want to just make the simple point that the top shows the policy for in emissions, and the bottom is the outcome in terms of temperature, with a really frightening future. But if we look at the immediate future, in the coming decade, the difference lies in the top diagram rather than the bottom diagram. Does that make sense? What I'm saying is the top diagram is very path dependent. The bottom diagram, in terms of adaptation, we're not seeing those differences. And therein lies a problem to persuade people in terms of the need to reduce greenhouse gases, but we mustn't confuse the two. And likewise, if we go for the even into the future, there's that situation. Your device turns off automatically. Please don't. Time left. Okay. So adaptation, and so this is a really interesting paper on sea level rise in the Lakes District in Victoria, where adaptation needs to slow down and have a process that we trust. So sometimes putting the extreme urgency on adaptation can be difficult. Expert accounts of a distant and discontinuous future contrast strongly with the continuity anticipated by residents across their remembered past, lived present and imagined futures. So how we manage those two. So here's I think this really interesting pathways work that was done for Eyre Peninsula, and here's the agriculture one of these, which is so I think this is really worth having a good look at. So this is showing the different pathways. Just in a simple point is that the black diagram below, the black lines at the bottom of this are the ones that were not favoured in discussion. Does that make sense? So what we're saying is that people are happy about talking about new crops, improved weather forecast, soil modification, increased income diversification, GM crops, but a move to pastoralism or transition away from food-based to carbon sequestration were not favoured by that discussion. Just what's interesting is when you look at all the other equivalent diagrams in this EP report, is that for conservation, for bluefin tuna, for water, everybody's happy about all of them. Does that make sense? So the agricultural people are the grumpy ones, who have the ones that they're not looking at the transformational changes, whereas other people were that. Interestingly, that one there was the bottom one there was the notion of the of higher density for the urban bushfire. But basically, agriculture are the ones that are saying these transformational changes we are less keen on. We want to keep doing what we're doing. There's this status quo bias, which is an emotional bias, a preference for the current state of affairs. The current situation is taken as a reference point, and any change in that baseline is perceived as a loss that's missing there. So, and I guess I'd say that within that, that diagram there shows that there's a lot of activity that's happening within farming systems on how to better manage water into the system and so on. I certainly have status quo bias in my own life in terms of that. There's this interesting counter to this is there's also an action bias. And so this is this point that people like me who go out and talking with farmers are wanting people to change. We're wanting to see action. There's this really interesting study of 286 top goalkeepers. So if you're a goalkeeper and someone's got to kick a penalty shot, you've got no time. You've got to guess whether you jump left, jump right, or stay where you are. Basically, this study, with people with a bit too much time on their hands, went and looked at how many times they jumped left, how many times they jumped right, and how many times they stayed in the middle. Basically, the best thing to do is stand in the middle. It sort of makes sense. You stand in the middle, you could have a much better chance of saving it. But 94% of the time, they either jump left or right. And they're saying, why is that? Well, if you've got a crowd behind you and everything else, and you just stand there and they go left or right, you look really dumb. There's a bias to act, to jump. And this is a management science paper that basically says that we have this bias that do something is always beneficial than standing there and waiting and seeing. And I think that we have an action bias, and we sometimes put that action bias countering the status quo bias. So here's Ororoo. You can see there's a lot of variability in income from wheat there. And this whole real options work is that everyone's waiting for the next year. It's really hard to make decisions to get out of wheat and into sheep if you don't know what the year-to-year variability is. And if that year-to-year variability is very, very high, you're always saying, if I get out of this, I'll lose out. Like what would have happened at Minapa. If you'd got out of cropping and taken the advice of some people at that time, you would have lost out in these last few years because the season's been good there. So I think that this is a diagram. This is a study that was done of development work, and a whole lot of stuff that was called adaptation was actually just was not changed from just good development. So this whole idea of how much we're just addressing the drivers of vulnerability, building capacity, managing climate risk, or confronting climate change. I think we need to have all of those. I'm not saying that what I'm saying is that time matters for both reducing greenhouse gases and adaptation. On reducing greenhouse gases, time is really ticking and it is really late. In terms of adaptation, we sometimes run the risk of over-rushing adaptation, and that can be a problem.